The following is a short thought from Chassidus on the theme of conformity versus individuality that has some tie-in to the Parsha. I say a short thought because that's my intention going into it, but I guess it waits to be seen whether we'll actually manage to keep this to a shorter length. But at least technically, material-wise, I am coming in with less material intentionally, and we'll see what we do with it. So this week's parsha, of course, Parsha Shlach. You have the story of the Meraglim. That's obviously the dominant part of the parsha, the first part of the parsha. Now, there's plenty in Chassidus on the topic of Meraglim. You have Likutei Torah. We have many sichos from the Rebbe. The Rebbe, we can say kochtich in Parsha Shlach, in the Meraglim, in of Shlichus, and much has been said, and there's much to say. But as we often do here, try to find ideas, thoughts, quotes that are a bit off of the beaten track in terms of exposure, familiarity, trying to find ideas that are valuable, that have resonance, that may have not received their due attention. And this is certainly one such case. This is not even something that was written directly on the Parsha, but looking through the Mitteler Rebbe's Torah, this is something I found in Torah's Chaim, the Sefer Torah's Chaim of the Mitteler Rebbe. Now is not the time to get into the background of the Mitteler Rebbe's Sfarim, but we know that the Mitteler Rebbe's Chassidus on the Parsha, in addition to his other Sfarim on other topics and other themes, so there's Torah's Chaim on Bereshis, which was printed earlier, and then there's Torah's Chaim on Shmos, which is not quite on the same darg as Torah's Chaim Bereshis, and it has other stuff mixed in. And then that's it. And then there's the set of Mamori Admor Tzoi, which starts again from Bereshis, whatever didn't make it into Torah's Chaim, and then for Vayikra B'Midbar Dvarim, that's where you'd look exclusively for the Torah of the Mitteler Rebbe, for those Sfarim, for those parshas. So this is in Torah's Chaim, the Mitteler Rebbe parshas Bereshis, Dibur Hamascho Vayitzer, Ois Chaf Ches on page Chaf Beis or so. And we're not going to get into the whole context, but the more immediate context there is that the model of Doimim Tzemeach, and perhaps Chaim Medaber as well, can be applied to elements within the human experience, meaning there are parts of the human that are more Doimim-like in nature, and there are parts that are more Tzemeach in nature. And specifically focusing on the Tzemeach, he describes the Midas Shebelev. The Midas Shebelev are equivalent to Tzemeach. They can grow, and he describes that at some length. And I've been trying to develop an appreciation, and not just for myself, but to try to convince or persuade or impress upon others about how much we should really appreciate how the Mitteler Rebbe takes the time to describe things, to paint a picture. Often, sort of the Alter Rebbe's Torah is seen as the default, and the Mitteler Rebbe is just seen as, there's a sefer that has it at 2 or 5 or 10 times the length. But I would argue that there's a difference between sort of knowing the bottom line versus being able to truly delve in. And what I would use, the term I would use would be to picture. The Mitteler Rebbe really paints a picture of for almost anything that he touches on. Obviously, even for Mitteler Rebbe himself, there are ideas that he might mention in passing if that's not the focus in a particular place. But if you look, you'll often find that there is somewhere else where he describes it at the greatest length, or there's like the one place where he talks about it at length. So in this case, he's describing how the Midas are b'fchinas tzemeach at some length, which we're not going to get into in order to keep things focused. But he concludes, after his description, he says, "V'alkein al kolpanim harei b'chinas tzemeach mamish ke'etz hasada mamish." The midas are mamish like tzemeach, mamish like a tree. She'etz yitzmach v'yigdal min hakatnos v'hoilech u'mischazek kol she'yigdal yoser. The tree starts from a very small state and it keeps sprouting and growing and getting stronger the more it grows. But then he adds an interesting point, which is in parentheses and seemingly sort of incidental, secondary to what he's trying to say, which is what midas are tzemeach. But he makes the following interesting point, and this is where he quotes a pasuk from this week's parsha. He adds in parentheses, "Mavur lamaila." It's explained either earlier or later. Sheyesh eitzim v'ilonis ketanim ugdoilim be'etzem mohusam la'achar shleimus gidulam. He makes the observation that when we say that trees grow and they start small and they reach their full size, that's not to say that all trees are then the identical size. No, after they finish growing, then you have trees in all sizes in their state of gadlus. They're still completely different sizes from each other after they can complete their growth. So that's what he's saying. That's by definition, by the very definition, some are small and some are big, and that's after they conclude growing. So in this analogy, so it's the eitzim versus the midas. It says v'kein hu b'midas the adam ein echad doime lachaveiroi b'midosav be'etzem uhusam. So the same goes for midas of a person. That no one person is similar to is similar to his friend in the context in reference to their midas by their very definition. V'yesh anshe midas gedolim be'etzem, v'anshe midas ktanim be'etzem. So just like the trees, there are those who have big midas, and there are those who have small midas. And here he quotes Taka from our Parsha, the Meraglim came back and they said, oh, these guys are Anshe Midos. So from this we see that everyone has midas. And now I'll elaborate a bit more briefly about the Taich and the Pasuk, but obviously everyone has midas, but they're coming back and saying these guys are Anshe Midos. So presumably they were saying about them that they were Anshe Midas Gedolim versus maybe other people that are Anshe Midas Ketanim. Interestingly, the Mitteler Rebbe adds the following disclaimer: "Ve'im ki pshutai anoshim bali koimo b'midas gedolos." Pasha pshat is that they were actually very tall, very big. B'midas gedolos meaning big measurements, big dimensions. But it's not to say, and this relates to what the Rebbe would emphasize, that when you have different taichin, they have to all be connected. Not that they're separate taichin, separate lanes that are disconnected. So this pshutai versus the taich we just said, because it's all the same idea. That was our whole premise, that we're making an analogy between midas and semeach. So in the pshutai, these guys are actually growing. They kept growing, and they grew until they reached such tremendous proportions, dimensions. So if we taich midas to mean their characteristics, or whatever exact translation you want to use for midas in the Chassidic context, so their midas are also gedolim, and their midas grew. So it's all connected linguistically, contextually. It's all saying the same thing. It's all expressing the same idea, that people grow physically and midas grow as well. So this is the passage that I wanted to call out and focus on, that has the most direct connection to the parsha, and I'll elaborate a bit on what I see here in this passage, and then I'll quote a few other passages in the Mitteler Rebbe that tie into the general point, to the general theme of Ein Adam Doime Lachaveiroi, and what we can learn from that, what I take away from that. But like I said, before we continue, I just want to comment on a few points relating to this passage. First of all, I find it interesting that he takes pains. He makes the point to say the imki pshutoi anoshim bali koimim midas gedolos, because Chassidus is full of taichin, of psukim that are seemingly not literal, and sometimes I guess it could raise the question as to what Chassidus actually thinks about the literal taich. And there are definitely places in the Rebbe's Sichos, look at the Sichos, in a few places where the Rebbe sort of addresses and acknowledges this, and the idea that the stories take place on multiple levels. There's the story in Asiya, and the story in Bria and Atzilos. Sometimes you have the question of Chassidus attributes spiritual motives to villains. Haman wanted to make the eights, Gavoya Chamishim Amma, and this was his cheshbon, or Parai, and weiter the question is raised, are we actually intending to say that was Parai's actual conscious kavana or not? So we're not getting directly into that, but it's interesting to see when earlier in Chassidus, perhaps this tension is acknowledged. And Mitteler Rebbe is, casually says his taich, his pshat, and says, keep pshutai. Now, it could be the reason why he said it is because the Taka stems very nicely. Meaning, if it didn't stem so nicely, then maybe he wouldn't have mentioned it and acknowledged it. Stamazoi to say imki pshute, I don't know how common it is. It will be interesting to go check how many other times it occurs. I didn't go check on this occasion. Obviously, if we went chased down every avenue would not be a short thought, would be a long thought. So anyway, that's interesting to note. With regard to the actual taich of Anshe Midas, so it's interesting to actually talk a little bit about the actual textual context and the meaning of the translation. So Anshe Midas is an interesting term. I'm not sure if it's the only time in Tanakh I saw the Metzayin to Ishmida in Divrei Hayamim. Didn't have a chance to look it up, so maybe it's more than once, but still not a very common phrase. But the words themselves, individual words, Anshe and Midas, don't seem to be so unusual and rare. So obviously, as the Mitteler Rebbe says, the standard taich is that Midas is Meloshin measuring and dimensions. And in fact, I believe in the old French translation that was used by the Jews of France, that Rashi quotes from or refers to, I believe the translation for Anshe Midas literally was de measure. So that was literally the same word that we have in English. That would have been the French taich, the laz. And in Yiddish, they use words like mos, moshaft, moshaftik, which also, of course, also has the same basic meaning of measure. So the Mitteler Rebbe is doing a bit of drush wordplay, you could say, in that midos is an interesting word in the sense that l'chayr in Tanakh, I assume midos only ever means actual dimensions, and then in Chazal, Perkei Avos, arba midos ba'adam, arba midos b'hoche beis hamedrash, etc. So midos is clearly used to some extent that way in Chazal, although it's possible that the word evolved further, meaning when you say that someone has good midos, I don't know if Chazal are quite using it that way. When Perkei Avos says arba midos ba'adam, it means that there are four modes, four approaches, for Ifana. I didn't spend the time to think it through, but one could sit and declare about how the word evolved. Perhaps the dictionary of Ben Yehuda has something to say on it. I didn't look it up. Right, but somewhere along the way, Midas came to mean, perhaps in the Middle Ages, Midas came to mean literally person's character traits. A person can have Midas Toivus, Midas Rois. Interestingly, we know the Rambam in Hilchos Deis uses the word Deis, which is interesting, and Deia is a tricky word to use because it could be used to mean other things as well. I may have recorded something that alluded to or maybe I just wrote it up. You'll forgive me that I don't always remember what I wrote and what I recorded, but there's something with the Rambam and Hu Hamada or Hu Hadeya, and what exactly the Rambam, which precise term the Rambam is using Deya to represent in that context. So Deya had many meanings, and the Rambam is using Deis for where we would use Midas, perhaps because Midas hadn't been coined yet to have acquired that additional meaning. But obviously somewhere along the way it came to have that meaning. And Mitteler Rebbe is, by the time you get to Mitteler Rebbe, obviously Chassidus uses Midas very freely in the sense of whether it's people's emotions, but also in sort of the Kabbalistic context of the Moichin versus the Midas in the spheres in that system. So Midas obviously has a very strong and broad term and has a strong and broad connotation and meaning in Chassidus. And the Mitteler Rebbe is taking that for granted. So when it says they're Anshe Midas, so that's the Mitteler Rebbe is leaning on that and doesn't really have to explain it and justify it. However, the Mitteler Rebbe is acknowledging that technically that's not the taich, not just the taich in the mitzias of the pasuk, but the taich linguistically in the pasuk. When the pasuk says Anshe Midas, surely the taich is in the more literal biblical sense of measurements. So it's actually interesting to point out that if you look in the Targumim and the Mefarshim on Anshe Midas, there is actually one exception, and that is the Targum Yonasan. If you look in Targum Yonasan, it actually says, and now I realize that I don't have it in front of me, but it says something roughly like, they are Guvrin de Mechilon Bishin, or something like that. Which, if you translate it back into, or it says More, maybe Guvrin that are More Mechilon Bishim, which if you translate it back into Hebrew, it would clearly, Mechilon is clearly, we have the word Mechilon in the sense of Mechilta, but if you translated that sentence back into Hebrew, it would clearly say that they are Anashim Bale Midos Rois. So even though the word mechilon itself could mean different things, but when you say more mechilon bishin or something like that, which clearly is saying bali midas rois, it's pretty clear actually that Targum Yonasan is translating the midas in the pasuk in the sense that we are more familiar with, that a person has midas rois. That also is clearly an interesting point and factor in our question of the usage of the word and the term over time. So it would seem that already Targum Yonasan is alluding to that kind of usage. And then the question would be why? Why Targum Yonasan? And perhaps also the Targum Yerushalmi Hashalem, for those who are familiar, also seems to have translations like this, Ayin Sham. So why are they translating it like this? I mean, partially it could just be Pashit Alt Pshat, that Anshe Midos, men of measurements, is a bit of a funny phrase. So the most reasonable, most obvious, most available taich is that it's referring to their size and their measurements, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that it fits nicely and beautifully within the words themselves. Sometimes you have to, when it comes to translation, if you take the question of translation seriously, you have to balance these factors against each other of what fits with the words versus what fits with the context. An example that comes to mind is actually from earlier in the this parsha, where it talks about the Arim. And the problem is that machanim is a very funny word to use for a city. B'machanim is seemingly much better suited to describe an encampment. So we're told where on the one hand, b'machanim of tzara might be more geschmack linguistically to taich in reference to a type of encampment. On the other hand, the context of the pasuk seems to be using it for a description of cities. And if you look in the Targumim and the Mefarshim and the various translations, the Laws of Taich, one sees that there was this tension, and there were those who leaned and pulled more towards saying maybe it is talking about types of encampments, versus those that say, well, it's talking about cities, so we have to taich it into cities, and Machane must mean a city that is not enclosed by a wall, even though that's not usually how the word would be used. Etc. So you have this, if you pay attention to these questions of translation, you have this tension a lot. So it's interesting. Now, Targum Yonasan, people might have an association that Targum Yonasan is full of midrashim, but someone who does spend time looking at Targumim and translations, Targum Yonasan fundamentally is still a literal translation. It just has sort of these haisafis within it. But if you want to know how a word is understood as translated, Targum Yonasan could certainly be used that way, and that's what Targum Yonasan is saying, that they came back and they said that these people are Bali Midas Urais, which is interesting. I saw that there's another taich in one of the more obscure Yishonim that Anshe Midas is Lashon Malacha, that they're Bali Malacha. So you see there were others that were troubled by the taich, were looking for another taich, trying to explore whether there are other taich in there. So there is this basis for actually reading the pasuk as relating to midas. Obviously, Lefia Targum Yonasan, it's Bali Midas Urais. Lefia Mitteler Rebbe, it seems like the vart is more that they are Anshe Midas Gedolim. It's not taking away from the connotation that it's large, but what's large? Their midas are large. They have big midas as opposed to people that have small midas. Interestingly, if you look through the Mitteler Rebbe's Torah, I did not find anywhere else that he uses Anshe Midas in this sense. Often I would be looking to see where the makbilot, where the texts that are expressing similar ideas, what they might be saying, what they might add. There will usually be some additional detail there that could shed light, but I did not find that Mitteler Rebbe uses this pasuk in this way anywhere else. However, he does use Anshe Midas in a few places, and it's usually in the context of describing the midas of Tohu. Now, more with a focus on Tohu Kipshutai, talking about the Olam HaTohu, but presumably that would imply that whatever we know about the midas of Tohu, so if we were to apply this to an actual person, so by saying that they're Anshe Midas, they have midas in the manner, in the style of the midas of Tohu. At any rate, like I said, he uses this line here, so even though that was certainly not the point here, it was mamish parenthetical, his point was that midas are b'chinas semeach, but I was interested more in this line and this idea about ein adam ein echad doimeh l'chaveiroi. So I went to see where else the Mitteler Rebbe talks about it. So another place Mitteler Rebbe talks about it, Bekitzer, is Taka earlier in Toras Chaim Bereshis, in the first Ma'amid Ibn Maschel Bereshis, is Ches. It's also talking about there, the context is about being mizbainin, how you build up a midah, and the more you think about it, the more you feel it, which is obviously a huge, famous point that Chassidus Chabad really focuses on and revolves around. So he's talking about different types of midas. There's midas of tayvara. This is good for you. This is bad for you. And then he says, even beyond that, forget about things that are good and bad for you, but just midas in general. Avas ha'oishe v'ha'kavod v'yiras ha'anios v'dalos v'shiflos shehu areva chayehafsid basic maso matn kahai gavna v'midas ha'rachmanios v'achzarios kanzonos v'pazonos yira and ava for non-immediate toivara, more adjacent to that. So in this case, loving wealth and covet, or fearing being poor, which is an interesting, relatable, perhaps example. Obviously, in the world we live in today, there are some who love wealth or fear being poor. So it's interesting that that's the example he gives. But at any rate, in that context, he throws in a line that the midah and the choice, whether to be meschased with people, to be merachim, kimot versus pizur, gam midas ela mutboim benefesh ha'adam betelalatoy mi betem. These are also imprinted in the person's soul congenitally from birth, from the mother's womb. And it's just complete diversity. It's there's a multiplicity to the extent that no two people are alike. And yeah, we find these midas in animals and birds as well. We describe the nesher, the oirev, and the chasida as possessing different midas. But this is all also just parenthetical. His point is about that the midas follow the type, the quality of the hisbeinus, etc. The place where I found this discussed at the greatest length in the Mitteler Rebbe's writing is actually in the Sefer Imrei Bina. Imrei Bina maybe is considered one of the least accessible svarim of the Mitteler Rebbe. It's has a reputation as being very difficult, very deep. But we're trying to demystify things around here and make things more accessible. So here's something very interesting, very readable, very accessible in Imrei Bina, in Shara Kriya Shema. Essentially, I have to go reread the Agdama, but the concept, the premise of Imrei Bina seems to be what to be mizbayrin about in davening. So there's Shara Kriyashma, and he's going through his bayinus of Kriyashma in tremendous detail, as the Mitteler Rebbe does. Some of it is perhaps more technical, more relating to Sfiris or Shtalshlus, but this part over here toggles back and forth between the more lofty stuff and the more concrete, practical, real-world examples. And the context, this is Ois Samach Zayin, so the context there is about Echad, and the Ches is the Zayin, Rekiim, and the Eretz, and the Dalet is Dalet Ruchos. He starts talking about the idea of Dibur, and how Dibur creates everything, but as Tanya explains, as you have Bekitzer, the beginning of Shayichud Ve'emunah, the idea of the Tzirufim of the Dibur, and how the Tzirufim create the different Bruim. So I would have to go check Shayichud Ve'emunah again to see whether the diversity and the multiplicity is emphasized as much. I think there the emphasis is almost a little bit fakert. The emphasis is a bit on the main words, the names of minim that are mentioned in the Torah, and the ones that have an explicit Hebrew name, versus perhaps other things that require more chilufim and tmuras from the Torah, if they're not mentioned directly in the Torah. But here in Imrei Bina, the emphasis is on the absolute diversity and multiplicity of tzirufim, and therefore of actual things in this world. And so he says there that from each tziruf, you get your own bria pratis, and every ois is his own hamshacha. I'm not getting into the technical side of that, focusing more on what he describes as the outcome of this system of tzirufim. And this is what Mitteler Rebbe says there. Therefore we see, so when it comes to madregas, we use the term madregas usually to refer to spiritual stuff. But here he's talking about down here, this is chalkas madregas. No two are alike, even within the same species, the same type. He starts giving examples. You won't find two doimims that are alike. You're not going to find two rocks that are alike. Every rock, even the types of rocks that are from the same type, but no two are alike. The metals, offer, rabim, and many types of earth. They're all beschalkos shoynus. Everything has differences, distinctions. And the same goes for tzemeach. In esav deme b'tzurase pulas l'chavere. No two grasses are alike in how they appear and how they act. V'chein bechalkei achai. And the same goes for the next level, animals, the living species. Gam b'min echad ein echad deme l'chavere. Even within one type, within one species, no two are alike, right? Anyone who hangs around animals, sheep, goats, but really anything, you recognize them. You can tell them apart. They're not interchangeable. And in many properties, many characteristics. And the same goes for the human species. This one's brain works this way. This one's brain works that way. Even if they're coming from the same type, even if they're coming from the same motivations, the same underlying broad, perhaps, personality types, but yet their minds still take it in different directions, take it to different places. And the same goes here, so he's distinguishing seichel from midas, and the same goes for midas. Ha'adam ein echad doimel lechaveiroi. Even if they're both chassadim guys or gvuras guys, and maybe we'll get a bit to that later of how the Mitteler Rebbe has a list of personality types in using these terms. So even if you're a chassadim personality type or a gvuras personality type or a chassadim midas type and a gvuras midas type, still ein echad doimel lechaveiroi. And why is that? So he's saying, and that's because Gam the Maila, B'Sher Shiruchni, of the Geshem, the Gashmis of Dem Tzemech HaMedaber, there's so much Chalkus, Tzirufim, and different Amshachas of the Ribu Shinuyet, Tzirufei Oisius, Shem Eschalkim Leinshir, back to the more technical side of how Chassidus expresses this, how the underlying mechanics of how this diversity is achieved. He says, Mar David, Marabba Masecha, Shirov L'Mayla Leinshir, so this ties back into our discussion last week, Taka, about Marabba Masach and Chassidus, and there the emphasis, the sources we quoted were emphasizing a bit about the Chilukei Tanugim. Here it's making the even more general point that Bichlal, look at the multiplicity of the species, and in each species gufa, no two are identical, no two are alike. And then a bit further on there, still in Samach Zayin, like I said, he's going back and forth between Lamaila and Lamata. So he returns to talking about it Lamata. He says in Yedua that Ifani has chalkus b'seichel l'midas sheba'adam yuchaliyas adin shir. The amount of version, the number of versions, the number of possibilities when it comes to seichel l'midas is infinite. He gives an example. Kamoish on we see shebeteva echad the mida achas. Let's pick one nature, one mida, one trait. Midas hanitzachon ukai gavna. Let's take the midah of nitzachin, of wanting to vanquish, to overcome, whatever the definition of netzach is. That's not the point right now. Yesh boriba yischalkus minim madregas b'vnei adam. So there's tremendous multiplicity of madregas among people. Zeh teva nitzchoinoi kach, v'zeh kach. The way this person applies his midas hanitzachin versus this other person, it's different. Each one's oifen hanitzachin is different. And he adds and he says, you can have generation after generation, thousands, tens of thousands, millions of people. And you won't find two people that apply the midah of netzach, that have the midah of the tav of netzach in the exact same way. Very vivid description of how different and how you won't find two that are alike. So that's the example he starts with. He says the same goes for hisparos. And the same goes for chesed, for gvura, la toiv, la ra. Ein shiur lo ifani yischalkusam b'tevei b'nei adam dor achar dor. There's no limit. It's infinite. The degrees of how many different types you could get among the tivei b'nei adam, people's nature, generation after generation. And the same goes for seichel. Again, like last time, both midas and the seichel. When it comes to seichel of b'nei adam, dor achar dor. Again, it appears, b'ribu yafanim shoinim, gama madrega achas, the same emphasis of, even within the same madrega, the same expressing roughly almost the same type of thing, it's still different. So he says, for example, a teva of chesed shebechachma. Right, so we're talking about chesed, but in the context of chachma, of your inclination, how you think about it. So take chesed shebechachma, lahatis klapi chesed uschus kamoy chachamim hema lahetiv. So you're thinking about the chachma is in applying the chesed. says this is also mischalek bekama rivavis b'nei adam beifanim shoinim she'ein echadem l'chaveri. If you have tens of thousands of people and they are all trying to apply chesed shebechachma, no two will be alike. No two will be identical in how they apply this. So that's in seichel. And then he goes on and says, and the same goes for ratzon and for tainug. This person enjoys this and wants this, and this person will not enjoy that at all. And again, even if they're in the same adrega, even if they're roughly, so today you could talk about the personality types or we have other tests, other nicknames that are used today to sort of group people and to classify people. So even if you already group them and you classify them and you say they're in the same grouping, afal pikein, the variation that you'll find will still be so big, so tremendous. And he says, "V'kach yuvan." So the same goes. Taka for the spheres l'mayla. There's also to be ischakos beifanim rabim lein shir. So bringing it back, often as Chassidus does, to bring it back to the spiritual equivalent. But then even that he sort of brings back down to express it begashmis. We're saying that there are so many ifanim l'mayla. That's the reason why the kach ein yom v'shah dem l'chaveri. There are no 2 days that are alike, and there are no 2 hours that are alike. Because every shah also, we use the term tzirufim. You have the 12 tzirufim, Shem Havaya, mentioned in Tanya. It's the story without the Rebbe in jail, and that's how he knew the time based on the tzirufim. So that's in terms of days and hours based on the tzirufim l'mayla. And he says the same goes for dairis. Dar heilich, v'dar bar, v'dar ba, dar l'dar shabach ma'asecha, these are psukim we use in davening. So in terms of things to think about during Shema, which this is more largely about, or things to think about during davening, so he's touching it into davening. What's pshat dur? What's the emphasis? What's the godless of multiple dairis? Says every dur is new, is different. Every dur receives its own new combination of erva shafa, of the spheres, tatzilus and biyah. No 2 generations are alike, and every dur has ribivais madregas, has millions of madregas, like it says in Zohar, "Vayomim yimei bikuri anovim," which I believe is also talking about Shishlach. She'oisei azman hoya esam shachas b'chinas gvudas deimo b'midas dezah. So Vayomim yimei bikuri anovim. The pasuk is coming and telling you that it's important that you should know that obviously in the Pashat Pshat, and like I said, most of the time we don't say the Chassidus doesn't bring it back to compare it to the Pashat Pshat, unless, like in the previous case, there's a connection between the direct, obvious connection between the Pashat and the Ruchnius. But the Pashat Pshat, it's saying that was the time of the year it was. You want to know what season it was. But the way Zohar teaches it is, it's important to know what was going on spiritually, what kind of hamshachas, what type of dur, what type of arrow was it spiritually. So Vayami, maybe Kurei Anovim is telling us that it was hamshachas, b'chinas gvuras dima b'midas dezah, etc. So the Mitteler Rebbe is clearly and emphatically emphasizing in these sources that no 2 things are alike, whether it's daimim, tzemeach, chai, medaber, midas, seichel, ratzon, tainug, even those that are mamish classified as coming from the same darga, the same hadrega. No 2 hours are alike, no 2 dairis are alike, no 2 eras. This is something that the Rebbe is emphasizing and describing in quite strong, vivid language. And there are a few other places where the Mitteler Rebbe also mentions this, but I don't see a point in quoting every single one. I think this certainly brings the point across. So what do I see here? What do I take from here? So first of all, I want to point out that last week there was something I was looking into which I never got never got around to recording. But I'll mention it here, is that in the Kutei Torah Ba'aloischa, the Alter Rebbe says that there's 7 natives, 7 madregas in avodas Hashem, yesh ovid me'ava moshech kamayim, yesh me'ava. It actually goes through all 7 midos there in Kutei Torah, but very, very bekitzer. Mitteler Rebbe, on the other hand, in his Maimer Ba'aloischa, Mamish goes through it at great length in a very beautiful way, and he describes sort of 7 personality types, but in avodas Hashem. And he analyzes the mile of each one and the chesaron of each one. Very interesting, very fascinating to me. And after I found that, I was looking into other places in Mitteler Rebbe's Torah where he also expresses similar ideas, at least to parts. Let's say the way he describes the chesed versus the gvura in avodah. He says the person who connects to the Eibusher through chesed, so the chesaron is that it could be b'murgash ublita yesera b'yeshes v'gasus, versus the person who's through gvura, through meridos, he can reach a state that he's built to yuchal lisbar latzma. He can't stand himself, and it harms his avodah. He almost has low self-esteem in avodah. Very interesting. Lashon is very interesting language. So for each prat, for the bliti yasei b'yeshus v'gasus, I found a bunch of places where Mitteler Rebbe describes that, and for the flip side, places where Mitteler Rebbe describes that. Very, very interesting, but not the direct point of our focus here. But at the beginning of that, he says, it's the same premise there. The same premise is that no two are alike, and here are a bunch of very large archetypes, but obviously there's much more detail, and perhaps even there he emphasizes that each one has many chilukei efanim. I'm giving you large, sort of broad categories, but then each one has many chilukei efanim in its own right, and you'll notice if you go through the language there that gets mentioned throughout. Interestingly, one of the sources I found that overlaps a bit with that is in the Sefer Derech Chaim of the Mitteler Rebbe, Shar HaTfilah, Perek Ayin Beis, and there the Mitteler Rebbe says a very interesting Hagdara. He says that these personality types in avodah, the way it was described, like I said, we saw it in Baal Escha, he says fundamentally they're actually based on your ordinary personality types. That he says the midas ava yida seichel the nefesh lekis kasher mulubashim b'midas v'seichel the nefesh hativis hakoil hu ba'ofen ha'atba the nefesh hativis v'la yishuna klam and ateva afilu k'koitzi shel yud. So it could be this elsewhere. There's a possibility that the nefesh lekis could be functioning and working on a level where it's not mulubish, just using the terms of Chassidus, not mulubish in the nefesh hativis. But what he's saying here is that when you are working with the midas v'seichel the nefesh hativis, which seems to be more of the default, so then your avodah personality type is essentially synonymous with your actual personality type. And he says, so therefore, someone who's rechav levov v'gas ruach in general, so then his avodah template, his avodah personality type will also be borachava, that personality that I mentioned briefly just now, that it's yigbal liboy ba'avodah, l'harim roish, which could be good, but could also be bad, and he'll think he's great, he'll think he reached the top of all the milas, and that's his personality type expressing itself in his avodah type. And if a person is timid in general, so his avodah will also be very timid, and he'll feel bad for himself, look down on himself. And in both places, in Baal Escha and Derech Chaim, he says that taka each one has milas, has chesroinus. The chesaron, obviously, of the first guy is that is gasus yigbal liboy. The second guy's chesaron is that he may have too much of a leiv nishbar nafshika offer. And he says this is all based purely on what he calls shinui oifen ativius, the nefesh ativis levad, which we would just say is a personality type. This guy is a Mar Levana, and this guy is a Mar Shchera. Mar Levana, Mar Shchera themselves are these ancient personality types. Really, there's four of them, but these are the two more famous ones. He says, and then he goes on and says a very interesting Hagdara there in Derech Chaim. He says, Mar Levana, someone who is very bright and is very jolly, very cheerful, so they don't feel themselves. They this heder hargashas atzmoi b'mila de alma. They aren't getting caught up with themselves. He says, Amar Shchera, min teva Amar Shchera, yistaef ha'etziv lirdoif rak acher atzmai. I find this passage very fascinating. Probably was really worth its own discussion, but it didn't happen in the Kaveh Baal Escha, so I'm cramming it in here. That someone who has Amar Shchera chases after themselves, they're very preoccupied with themselves, and if they lack something, it bothers them tremendously. And then he says, so that's the personality type, so then if they were to engage in avodah satfila, so the avodah satfila would also be along the same lines and feel very bad for themselves and feel very lowly. And then he goes on and says, "V'yesh ma'ala b'zeh, ma'ashein b'zeh, v'yesh chesaron b'zeh, ma'ashein b'zeh, shneim emes, v'yiratz l'fnei Hashem, kavan ha'toiva sheb'shneim, ki zeh v'zeh, chaftzon be'olikim." Very interesting theme the Mitteler Rebbe is writing that, like I said, repeats itself in the Baal Escha context and in Derech Chaim here as well. But here very clearly saying that it's essentially whatever your personality type is, regardless, that's going to shape the experience if one were to engage in avodah. But at any rate, the subtext there as well is that there are many chilukei efanim in each category specifically. And that's the point that is being emphasized in particular in the text, the quotes that we just cited here, that even within the particular type, even within, it keeps on emphasizing, even if they are Mishodesh Echad, even if they are Madrega Achas, Mechasad, Gvuras, you still won't find two that are identical, that are truly alike. There is still so much room for the individuality, for one's own individual imprint and style and approach to how to apply that, how to carry that out. So what do I take away? To summarize, first of all, like I mentioned, this ties in with the theme of Marabu that we spoke about last week, and it also ties in with the other Baalescha stuff that I was malaket last week that I just cited Bekitzer just now. But more directly to the point, the theme, the emphasis here is that today I think there's a lot of discussion about the question of conformity versus individuality. And often I think sociologically, when one speaks about the Jewish world and the Haredi world specifically, and the Chassidus world maybe even more specifically, there's often the sense that Chassidus, being Hasidic, demands a certain level of conformity that one may not necessarily see elsewhere. And there are those who grow up within Chassidus that feel that their individuality is perhaps being stifled, etc. This is a theme I think that's fairly common. So I think it's very interesting, very fascinating to see how Dafka, the Mitteler Rebbe, Dafka within Chassidus, Dafka within this early stage, Mitteler Rebbe seems to Dafka be emphasizing the degree of individuality, how unique each and every person is, and how no two are alike. And the implication certainly is that, and perhaps the reason for why he would be saying this and emphasizing this is that early Chassidus genuinely was about not going with the status quo. It was about people seeking a real connection to the Eibishter and not settling for just going through the motions. And in that context, if a person wants to develop their connection to the Eibishter, so that if you want it to be real, so it has to reflect your reality, the reality of your existence. And we're talking about in the Chabad mode that involves being misboinen and being mispal. So it was very important to mention, to note, to acknowledge that no two people react to the same thing the same way. This is something that the Rebbe clearly also mentions up front, very much in Sefer Tanya as well. But I think in Tanya it's still Fiyarech Bekitzer, where it's just sort of said as it could be taken a little bit more as just a slogan. Yesh Mispal, etc. Also in the Hakdama about Sifnei Musar, that no two people are excited by the same thing. So, but it's sort of said, it's acknowledged, and then by Gefahren, it's not necessarily applied or taken seriously to the extent that might be necessary. So, to me, it's important to see Dafka how the Mitteler Rebbe really takes the time and the trouble to depict it in great detail and to really paint this picture and present this picture to us of how no two things in the world are alike, no two people's midas, no two people's seichel, ratzon, tainug are alike, no two deiros are alike. Growing up within a school system, so often you also sort of notice it in terms of grades. You think about it in terms of grades. People that are in the staff of yeshivas, they'll say, oh, this grade has this characteristic and this grade has this characteristic, meaning even when you gather 20, 50, 100, 1,000 kids together, they don't always average out, and you don't just get the same effect constantly over and over again. But Adraba, you notice the differences, the distinctions, and no two deiros are alike. And of course, obviously within American larger culture right now, there's always this tremendous hang-up about the boomers versus the Gen X, Gen Y, Gen Z, Gen Alpha, all these terms that get thrown around. Obviously, they're a bit arbitrary in terms of where you draw the line. But there's this preoccupation with the fact that every door, and you can literally see the doors side by side, are not operating in the same way. So if you're aware of that, if you're cognizant of that, and what you're trying to offer to people is meant to be tailored to them as a person to boost their ability and their likelihood to be matzliach and avodas Hashem, so then clearly you can't just be offering the same thing every door or to every person the implications strongly are that Yiddishkeit, or B'nai Hashem, has to be individualistic. Now, obviously, there's still a degree to what we mean when we say individualistic versus conformism. Obviously, if you have 10 Chassidim with a shtreimel, and each one is serving Hashem differently, obviously to an outsider, they probably all seem to be strongly conforming and all seem to be exactly alike. But that's not necessarily the best metric. Obviously, there's also a sort of a fallacy where we tend to notice distinctions in people similar to us and not really see the differences in people that aren't similar to us. But also, obviously, we're talking within the framework of Torah, the framework of Yiddishkeit, which is obviously its own discussion as to the importance of the framework and asus yog la Torah and all of that, which we're not getting into. But obviously, the premise is let's talk about people that are following Yiddishkeit, Ashkenazim, Chassidim, following Chassidus Chabad for the sake of this discussion. The takeaway still seems to be that it can't be one size fits all. You can't be giving everyone the same material, expecting everyone to react the same, to act the same, to behave the same. The implication is that there has to be room to find yourself and to find what works for you within the larger world of Torah Chassidus, of Darchei Chassidus. Of course, Torah Chassidus, of Chassidus Chabad, happens to be so large and be so diverse itself in terms of its ideas and themes that I certainly believe that if we left people to their own devices, they would gravitate towards the parts that speak most to them. And that was something I was getting at a bit last week as well, in terms of the idea that some may want to focus more even on Inyonei Ha'olam, Avos Olam, and the Merabah Masecha and how it fits in within that context. But even within the world of Chassidus, even if you're not bringing it all the way down to Avos Olam, there's so much to choose, to focus, to pick from, and that ties into how I sort of started this whole discussion, which is that this is the famous Titus on Shlach, but maybe people want to see other options. Maybe people want to find other ideas for Parsha Shlach that may speak more to them, or at least speak more to them right now. Every day and every Shah is also different. So what spoke to you today might be different than what speaks to you tomorrow. So I think it's just important, like I said, I'm sure people listening to this have all encountered the idea in some form. The question is, how much have we thought about it? How much have we considered how to apply it? Part of what his bonus is, or part of what the Mitteler Rebbe is sort of doing in the form of writing is forcing us to actually think about it and to think about the implications. So those are my thoughts. Now that's my takeaway from these sources, which is all sort of indirectly, all just from the words Anshe Midas. The idea that there's different types of people and there's different types of midas and there's big midas and small midas, but the lesson that I see here, that I see the Mitteler Rebbe expressing in a number of places, is that individuality is very important within the world of Chassidus, within the world of Chassidus Chabad, and it is important for people to be able to find themselves within that context. This obviously does sort of lead us to questions about different drachim in general, but I don't know if this is the time and the place to get into that. But again, speaking within the context of Chassidus Chabad, taking Chassidus Chabad as the premise, there's still a lot of room for individuality, and I don't see conformity as being a value, a point of importance. And I think even historically within Chassidus Chabad, I think through the Dairis, there was a lot of room for individuality. Like I said, most people back then, there was no chance that you would even learn all the Mamarim. People found the Mamarim that spoke to them, they copied them into their Bechel, and those were their Mamarim that they lived with. And everyone emphasized the parts that they enjoyed learning, they emphasized the aspects of avodah that they like to talk about. Obviously, in reality, we see people tend to have their favorite vart and their favorite thing. But to some extent, it also feels like there is pressure to conform, there is pressure to speak about the same things, to emphasize the same things. I think even within the Rebbe's Torah itself, there are certain parts that get emphasized more, and there's sort of a pressure to focus on those more, to conform more in that sense. And I don't think that's necessarily mukhrach. I think there's plenty of room for people to find themselves and their interests even within the larger corpus of the Rebbe's Torah, and certainly within the larger corpus of Chassidus Chabad, which the Rebbe obviously wasn't coming to replace. And like I like to emphasize, that Rebbe himself was always every week finding new corners, winkelach of Chassidus Chabad, often interesting, obscure stuff that the average person wasn't looking at. So when I look at the Rebbe, I certainly see a lot of that, of searching, of finding something new, something that's appropriate to the time. Obviously, the Rebbe had the things that he kochten more, and obviously Chassidim are going to emphasize those things more. But sometimes it just seems like it's society and conformity that chooses to emphasize certain things, whereas there could certainly be room to focus and emphasize other things. And often choosing to emphasize something is very meaningful and is very impactful, and it's not just an innocent choice, especially when your choice impacts other people. Like I say many times, when it comes to even different groups in Yiddishkeit, everyone has Makaitis. Everyone quotes Makaitis from Chazal. The question is, which Ma'amar Chazal you choose to emphasize. By choosing to emphasize a certain Ma'amar Chazal, you can create an entire different stream and branch of Judaism. Obviously, the example that I'll say Beketzer is if you emphasize the Gemaras about the Gimel Shavuos, so you have a very, very specific brand of Judaism where that's the biggest emphasis. So emphasis isn't just an innocence out, again, depending on how much you demand of other people to conform to that emphasis. If that's the pressure, and everyone is sort of compelled to focus on that emphasis, so you're making many major decisions for people that they didn't necessarily make themselves. And the same goes even within a particular group. There's much impact. There's a tremendous effect created by choosing what to focus on and pushing people to conform to that. Whereas I think that allowing people, obviously there has to be some context, some guidance, not a free-for-all. There has to be some working definition of what Chassidus Chabad is and what's acceptable and what are the accepted ideas within that framework. So these are all larger, interesting questions. But assuming that's all taken care of and addressed, there's still a lot of room for choosing, for searching, for finding oneself, for individuality. And I guess you could say that to some extent, that is an ingredient of what I am doing here to some extent with this project, which is to call attention, both more generally in this case, to the very idea of individuality, but also to show by example of what we are able to find and discover and have a kochen, have a geschmacken, if we are allowed to look and search for what we find speaks to us.